Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Subbu, and I lead the parsing team at the Wikimedia Foundation. And as you might know, one of the things that we work on is Parsoid. And so there are plans to make Parsoid the default parser in the coming years. And so one of the things that means is that extensions will now have to work with Parsoid. And so we've been working to develop an extension API that enables extensions to do this. And so this is a really, really early look at what we've been working on, and so we can get some feedback. So first things first, let's go through a quick background. So I already said we have two parsers right now. So the MediaWiki core parser is one that's been around since 2003, and it takes Wikitext and generates HTML for the Wikitext. And Parsoid is a different parser, which not only can convert Wikitext to HTML, but can also take HTML and convert it back to Wikitext. And so Wikitext has been, the core parser has been around since 2003, and it's still being used for a whole bunch of products, the most important being read views, which is the substantial amount of traffic to the MediaWiki software, and also on the Wikimedia cluster. It's also used for the mobile web, iOS app, and the Action API. And Parsoid, on the other hand, was developed primarily for supporting Visual Editor, but since then it's evolved to take on a lot of other clients. It supports the 2017 Wikitext editor, so the preview button that you use comes from Parsoid. Flow uses Parsoid content translation. The Android app is based on Parsoid's rendering. The linter extension that flags errors in Wikitext is also based on Parsoid's linting tool. The Kivix offline reader uses Parsoid content. Google also uses Parsoid's API to extract information from the content to identify templates and so on. And the REST API, if any of you use the REST API, then it's also backed by Parsoid. So originally in 2012, when we started, this was based in, it was written in JavaScript using the Node.js framework. And last year we ported it to PHP, and it's right now being integrated into MediaWiki core. I won't go into the details of the reasoning as to why we decided to port and how it's going to help. There's a tech talk from last year that goes through this, as well as the longer-term roadmap. Yeah, so the tech talk slides as well as the video are on the MediaWiki tech talks page. So the plan, broad plan, the roadmap is to use Parsoid everywhere, including read views, all the use cases for Wikitext parsing that currently MediaWiki has. And the main reason is that the legacy parser really cannot support Parsoid clients because it cannot convert HTML back to Wikitext, and it doesn't have all the annotations. The annotations in the HTML provide a lot more information to clients, so you can identify content that came from extensions. You can identify content that came from templates. You can demarcate what kind of links there were. You can get information about media and so on. So the broad parsing team goal is to make Parsoid the default MediaWiki Wikitext engine. And this is going to happen in a series of steps. It's not going to happen all at once. The first step, and that's our focus right now, is to start transitioning this on the Wikimedia cluster, maybe in the next 15 to 18 months. That's probably an optimistic timeline. We'll probably discover a lot of problems, compatibility issues as we start doing this replacement. But that's the initial focus. So even at that time, MediaWiki will continue to have both Parsoid as well as the legacy parser. And eventually, as we move on, we may get rid of the legacy parser altogether. But I can't tell you how long out that is at this point. So what does this mean for extensions? So today I'm going to focus primarily on extensions that define extension tags, number one. And secondly, I'm only going to focus on one direction, that is converting Wikitext to HTML. Given that Parsoid supports both directions, Wikitext to HTML and HTML to Wikitext, some extensions might choose to support their own handling for converting HTML back to their extension source. This is especially the case if, for example, you want to provide custom editing support in tools like Visual Editor. But I'm going to skip all that today. So here is a very high-level overview of how this is going to work. So we are not going to change the registration mechanism. It's still going to be based on extension.json. That said, we are still working out what those details are, but there probably is going to be a section related to Parsoid in there. But beyond that, here are the primary differences from the current scenario, or you can also think of these as constraints that we're imposing. First of all, if you're an extension developer, you know that the output of an extension is probably an HTML string. It could be Wikitext, partially processed Wikitext, for example. But in the Parsoid land, the output of an extension is always a DOM fragment, completely processed. There is no notion of partially processed. Secondly, you will not get direct access to the parser itself. You will have to have all the interactions through an API object. And this gives us better control in terms of evolving the interface in the future and not exposing internals of the parser engine itself to extensions. This makes for more stable development overall in the long run. And thirdly, currently hooks are primarily event-based. So before something happens or after something happens, for example. But in the Parsoid land, we won't define events. It'll be primarily transformations. So convert something to something kind of hooks. And lastly, Parsoid does not guarantee the order in which extensions will be invoked. So that means, let me restate that. I mean, we won't guarantee the order of the same extension tag on the page. So you won't be able to maintain global ordering by maintaining variables in the extension. So for example, you won't be able to maintain counters based on how you encounter your own extension tag. So I'm going to go into this a bit more detail later. And lastly, as I said, HTML to Wikitext transformation is optional. Parsoid provides you with some default handling. But in the long run, some extensions, if you provide custom editing support, you may decide to provide your own handler for this. So parser hooks, so any parser hook that are named after legacy parser internals will not work in Parsoid. So parser before strip, parser after strip, parser before tidy, after tidy, and so on will not work directly. So we probably will be developing mappings and figuring out what the equivalent functionality is. So all of the transformations in Parsoid are transformation hooks. So source to DOM, or DOM to source, or lint handler. And right now, these are the only 3 hooks we define. And I expect going forward, we'll probably have a few more. And we'll also probably figure out how to map the current hooks to the new hooks. So you don't have to worry about that right now, but that's the plan. And as I said, the registration is through extension JSON mechanism. And Parsoid will recognize extensions that implement the extension interface. This extension interface is defined in the Parsoid namespace. And this currently has only one method, getConfig. And so let's look at an example. So here is an example config from the site extension. So it defines the name of the extension, pretty obvious. And it also defines an array of extension tags. And each of those array elements is itself a configuration object for the tags that the extension is defining. So in this case, site defines ref and references. And so the ref tag, you declare what is the implementing class. And that class is supposed to extend the extension tag abstract class. And we also provide some options for Wikitext to HTML and HTML to Wikitext directions. The docs have more information about this. And lastly, there's also, this is probably a new concept. There's also a notion of DOM processors. So currently there's exactly one DOM processor. So this is invoked at various times in the parsing pipeline, DOM processors, parsing or even HTML to Wikitext. So in this mode, you get access to the entire DOM in the current parsing pipeline. So that's how you inspect content. And the content on this particular DOM will be in order. So this is how, by walking the DOM, we can inspect the ordering. And we'll go look at an example later. So right now, there's only one processor that the extension config defines. That is the Wikitext to HTML post processor. So this means this is going to be invoked pretty much at the end of the parsing pipeline. So probably the roughest equivalent would be before or after tidy, for example, something like that. And the extension tag class defines the transformation hooks with some dummy implementations. So currently there are just 3 transformations that are defined: source to DOM and DOM to source. And as the green highlights indicate, the source to DOM takes a string and you return a DOM. And DOM to source takes a DOM and return a string. And we expect that most extensions, extension tags will implement source to DOM at the very minimum. So as part of the implementation of your extension tag, especially if you're dealing with Wikitext, you may want to parse Wikitext, or even otherwise you may need to convert HTML to DOM, or you may need to get information about the config and so on. All this happens through the ParsoidExtensionAPI object. So this is the blue API argument in the transformation hooks. So broadly, the category of methods are Wikitext to DOM and DOM to Wikitext, and HTML to DOM and DOM to HTML. You might wonder why we have HTML to DOM and DOM to HTML methods, because you may be able to use, you think, things like libxml or other DOM libraries. This is because for performance reasons, Parsoid maintains the DOM in a certain canonical optimized state. And using these API methods will make your DOM more compatible with the rest of the pipeline. And anyway, I won't go into all the details, but you can look at the docs. But the API is how you interact with Parsoid. And this is one thing to note. This the current definition which you find in the docs is incomplete, and we'll be updating this based on need and feedback. And just over the last week, we looked at various extension sources. And based on that, we found we already have a few gaps, which we'll address in the coming weeks. So let's look at a couple of examples to make this a little bit more concrete. So imagine that there's a raw HTML extension. So this is used by parser tests, for example. So this slide is a complete implementation. So it implements the extension interface. And so you have the get config, which defines exactly one tag. The name of the tag is RawHTML. And it says that the same class is implementer, which is why it also extends the extension tag class. And in this case, it implements exactly one hook, which is a source to DOM. And it does nothing fancy. It just converts the HTML string to a DOM. And so that's all it does. It uses the API to convert the source HTML string to DOM and returns it. So a couple of observations at this point. So the main thing to note here, as I said, is this an output is a DOM. And more importantly, it behaves like an independent document. So if there are any markup errors in the HTML string, all the errors are localized. It will not affect the top level page. So this is unlike the current regime, where if you had potentially markup errors, either due to user error or because a bug in the extension, it might percolate back into the top level page. But that will not happen when you return a DOM. The only exceptions are, of course, if you actually break HTML5 content model. So for example, you cannot embed link in links. So if your extension returns a link and somebody uses the extension tag in a wiki link or an X link, then obviously that's going to break. And the second important thing is that the output DOM is not further modified. It goes untouched all the way pretty much till the end. So this is similar to the strip state mechanism that extensions currently explicitly manage. So you do not have to deal with strip state at all, because the content from an extension is currently tunneled all the way to the end through the parser stages. So let's look at a couple more examples. But before that, it's useful to look at what kind of extension tag types there are. So broadly, by looking at how they handle Wikitext. So there are some extensions which don't deal with Wikitext at all. For example, nowiki, the pre-tag, syntaxhighlight, RawHTML. So broadly, you can think of this extension taking the input and doing some processing and returning a DOM. So there's really no Wikitext manipulation involved. Or you might have extensions that are a very thin wrapper over Wikitext, for example, the ref tag. So in this case, you'll probably use the API method to pretty much parse the Wikitext and return the DOM. And there are some extensions which where the content is more or less Wikitext. For example, the poem extension, it has some special semantics. For example, how it handles new lines in nowikis or new lines in general, and also how colons are handled. And so you won't be able to use that content directly with the parser. So you'll have to process it beforehand so that the string you pass to the API looks like standard Wikitext. And then you have to post-process the DOM to generate the output you need. And lastly, you may have extensions like gallery, which has snippets of Wikitext in there, but it's not entirely Wikitext. So in a gallery, every line is an image Wikitext line, not entirely standard Wikitext. For example, the opening and closing brackets are missing. So you, as you can imagine, you'll probably loop through a single line and parse the Wikitext and then build your DOM. In the case of gallery, the gallery constructs a scaffold for the entire gallery, adds a caption, and sticks in every single image based on the parse output. So let's look at the pre as an example. The config I'm skipping because it's probably pretty obvious how it's going to look. But let's look at how it is converting its input source to the DOM. In this case, it's pretty straightforward. Pre simply takes the content of the tag, strips nowikis, decodes Wikitext entities, and stuffs that into a pre element. So in this case, you're using the API to construct the empty document, the DOM. You're using the API to sanitize the args. And then you're sticking the output in the pre element directly into the body. A small tangential note here, which is highlighted in red. So libxml is currently not compatible with DOM2. So as part of the porting of Parsoid to PHP, we built a compatibility layer on top of libxml, which gives you more standard DOM semantics. So anybody who's interested in the details can take a look at the bug report there, which has more information. But broadly, we encourage you to be to use the DOM compatibility layer rather than libxml directly, because it's going to give you more standard semantics for DOM manipulation. One more example, let's look at the ref. So ref, as I said, is simply a very thin layer over Wikitext. And it's a very simple implementation. This is all, this is pretty much the entire implementation of the ref tag. So it has some checks to detect nested refs. So ref has some constraints around when nesting is allowed. So those are all the checks I'm skipping here. But beyond that, it just takes the Wikitext and asks the API to convert the entire content to DOM. Additionally, it's asking the API to wrap the output in a soup tag. And thirdly, you might know that the ref tag does not have paragraph wrapping. So the API provides you semantic control over that by saying, declaring that this is to be parsed as if it's inline context. So in an inline context, paragraphs are not wrapped, and there is no indent pre even. So indent pre is where you can leave a white space at the beginning of a line to create Wikitext pre-like output. So in inline context, both are disabled. So if you know how site works, you might be wondering that does not make sense. That's not the entire implementation, because that handler just returned the DOM of the content of the ref. For one, it does not generate the numbered links that you see on a page when you use ref. And for another, the content is not in the references section at all, right? So what happens? How does that work? So if you remember earlier in the config for site, I referenced the DOM processors, and specifically the Wikitext to HTML post processor. So in this case, the ref handler uses the site extension relies on this post processor to do these two things. This is because, number one, the ref handler does not have access to the final DOM. All it knows is it's just the content embedded within the extension. And secondly, as I said very early on, the ref handler really cannot count in the right order to generate links. So the work for doing both of these is left to the post processor. And this post processor is invoked by Parsoid when the full page is constructed, almost at the very end, when pretty much all the information is there on the DOM. I'm going to skip the caveats here. And the site processor uses this to walk the tree in depth first order to count and number the refs. And secondly, it also migrates the content of the soup tag to the references section and leaves behind the number link. So this is how you get global numbering and counters through post processors on the entire page. So now that we looked at a couple of examples, let's broadly look at how the APIs map. So if you've been using the various parse methods currently, so there are a whole bunch of those that you might be using with the current parser, like parse, internal parse, and so on. All of those are pretty much handled by these two methods, extension tag to DOM or Wikitext to DOM. Those are pretty much identical. There's not substantially different. The only difference is the use case where you need to use it. When your extension tag like ref wraps Wikitext and the entire content is Wikitext, then you can just simply call the API to process the whole tag as Wikitext. So that's really easy. But if your tag contains Wikitext fragments, but not all of it is Wikitext, then like for example, gallery, then you can use Wikitext to DOM to pass the Wikitext fragments and get a DOM back. And then you can do whatever you want with the DOM, transform it or insert it somewhere else in your output and so on. But beyond that, both of those are pretty identical. So one thing to note here is that extensions do not get any control over how much parsing happens. So in the current core parser, recursive tag parse and internal parse return what is called as half parsed HTML, and there are other methods which return fully parsed HTML. And in Parsoid, we're deliberately not doing this, so to just make for cleaner semantics, and because Parsoid automatically handles taking care of, by using standard Wikitext semantics, it takes care of links, lists, bullets, quotes, every single time it's found in your extension. So there is some amount of semantic control you do get, but for example, inline context I mentioned earlier, but you really cannot selectively turn pipeline stages on or off or run stages selectively. So if your extension deals with special semantics, then you got to handle it internally by mangling the input as necessary. For example, the poem does it, gallery does it, and where required, you might rely on the DOM post processor. And also strip markers I mentioned earlier, and in Parsoid land, you really don't need to deal with it at all because strip markers is a mechanism to tunnel your output through the parser stages. And since Parser automatically does it for you, you really don't need to deal with it. So I think all the hooks and methods related to strip markers will not exist in Parsoid. And if at all we find it's really necessary, we'll try to figure out what equivalent functionality is and add that later on. So in terms of next steps and documentations, I think one best way to do it is look at the code or at the, so the Wikimedia Parsoid ext namespace has these three classes: extension, extension tag, and ParsoidExtensionAPI. And there are also a bunch of helper classes, DOM data utils, Wikitext utils, etc. And there are also a couple of core Parsoid classes, which I didn't cover in this talk, but you'll find information in docs later, in documentation on Wiki in a couple of weeks. And there are also a couple of helpers, which I mentioned, like the DOM compat layer on top of libxml, and also DOM utils, which are generic utilities for dealing with the DOM. So more docs. The extension API wiki page is still under development. I started working on it just about 10 days back, I think. And it's pretty much heavily a work in progress. And there is still a lot of code in Gerrit, which have not been merged. And so there's going to be more code changes. So you can look at Parser's implementations for the various extensions and look at the PHP docs. And you might also benefit by looking at the HTML spec for Parsoid. So in terms of next steps, so we will be soliciting feedback from multiple venues. So as it turns out, this is the very first venue, which is getting a detailed look at this draft. And of course, going forward, we'll be consulting internally with various Wikimedia Foundation teams who develop extensions on WikitecL, MediaWikiL, OnWiki, also go to TechCom and RFC process. And we'll be refining this for a couple of more weeks before it's probably ready as a first real draft. And there's also ongoing work to narrow the parser PHP interface to make some of the deprecations easier and also to make some of the transitions. Also make it clear what of the parser API is actually being used by extensions. So we are in a better place to figure out what is the functionality we need to support. And so now is a pretty good time to give us feedback and hope to have a usable first version initially only for Wikimedia Foundation use in the next 3 months. And I do want to emphasize that we'll do our best to not break things unnecessarily. but some things may break, but we'll try to work with you as much as possible. That's it. Thank you. And in the backup slides, I have more information about other extension implementations if you want, but you probably don't need more details right now. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Subbu. So I will open it up now to questions. Raise your hands in chat if you'd like to ask Subbu a question about this.
Should I stop sharing the slides and just get out the video?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
Whatever's easier for you.
All right.
Okay. Everybody's digesting this. There's a lot.
I know, sorry, it was a lot of information. I know it's a lot of information.
All right.
And I think I also speak too fast. I don't know how much that, I try to slow down occasionally, but, and it just, I start, anyway.
I have the same problem. Okay, but we are starting to see some questions in the chat. So Yaron, your turn.
Well, I have a few questions. One, a general one. Is there going to be some period of time when both Parsoid and the, I don't know what you call the old MediaWiki parser, the MediaWiki parser, are going to be both working at the same time, and you'll be able to, an extension will be able to choose which one to use, or the wiki will have it configured which one to use, something like that?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, as long as you're using, you're not using Parsoid entirely for everything, an extension will, will need to kind of, both will need to exist. And it's only this advanced notice is so that you can also develop your extension to work with Parsoid as well. So when we actually switch, or you decide to switch, it'll then work seamlessly with Parsoid as well. And one way to test it is just by looking at how your output looks in Visual Editor, for example. So you can, yes, so to answer your question, both will need to exist for a while. And it's only when you completely transition to Parsoid is when you can get rid of the implementation for the old parser.
Yeah, okay. Will there potentially be wrapper functions that you can call?
Yeah, we are considering various wrapper functions to kind of just transition wherever possible.
Right,
make it easier to transition.
Yeah, so you don't have to choose, you don't have to support both. My more technical question is, you know, you mentioned that there are all these different right now methods for parser. There's internal parse and I forget all the other ones, but they have different behavior. And as an extension developer, sometimes it's tricky to know which one to use, and sometimes it leads to there's I don't know what they're called, unique KINU error. Errors.
Script tags. They're all script tag related errors. Yeah.
Yeah. So will that work better with Parsoid? Is there less chance of that kind of error happening?
Definitely. I mean, we hope so. I think that there is no notion of strip state in Parsoid at all. So if you go through Parsoid, you'll never see any of those unique KINU errors because, as I said, once you pass Wikitext, what you get is a complete process DOM. There are no strip tags in there.
Yeah.
It's very simple interface. You just give Wikitext and you get it DOM.
Yeah. So I guess there isn't the concept of state with Parsoid.
As much, no.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
It's
okay.
pure transformations. That's the plan.
That's great. That's very good to hear. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Darren.
Yeah, a lot of this is hard for me to understand. I do develop some extensions, and then there's a lot of other extensions that we use that, like James has developed. I guess I'm just asking, it would be really cool if there were walkthroughs or examples of how to convert extensions to the new system to help those of us that are slower. And then my question is also just, I'm curious if we know what to expect for things like page forms and semantic MediaWiki and cargo and numer alpha and parser functions, some of these more broadly used extensions. I'm curious, like, are those conversions already in the works, or is it going to be a big deal, or is it going to be kind of transparent to us that just make use of these awesome extensions?
Yeah, to answer your first question about walkthroughs and documentation, yeah, we'll try to provide as much help as possible. And I think one of the easiest ways is by looking at extensions, which will probably have implementation side by side that we port or somebody in the foundation ports, number one. But yeah, we'll try to provide help as much as possible. And secondly, I cannot answer your question without looking at those extensions that you mentioned, because that's not something we are undertaking immediately right now. And as I said, I think the initial focus for us as a parsing team, which is a very small team, is to make this transition for the Wikimedia cluster. And so at that time, the core MediaWiki, the MediaWiki software itself will still have the old parser. So all the old hooks will still be there. So we are not expecting all the extensions everywhere to be transitioning over right away. So that's a longer process. And so I think in the next 15 to 18 months, as we work on the internal extensions, so we'll get a much better handle on what kind of problems there are, what kind of coverage gaps there are. And I think it'll be easier to answer questions like these later on. But in some cases, we'll be doing them ourselves, but in many cases, it's not possible for us to do the migration ourselves. Okay. I don't know if that answered your question or if that was your question, but let me know.
Well, and I was kind of hoping that there were some other participants here that could speak up on how big a deal this is to convert their extension. I mean, because I have no idea.
I think in some cases, so here is my take on that. I think in a lot of the cases, a lot of the extensions that implement tags are simply converting their content to HTML. And they may have Wikitext in some cases, but I think most of those are going to be pretty straightforward. And there's going to be simple renaming and mapping of method names, or in some cases, even simplifications because you're not dealing with strip state. But beyond that, if your extension is doing a lot of more complex content management and there is Wikitext snippets in there, or if there are hooks that you're using that change the behavior of the parser, for example, those are the ones that maybe need more work. If you don't change the behavior of the parser, you're just relying on the parser to convert content, then it should not be very difficult. It should be pretty straightforward. Site, for example, has been one of the, I mean, we worked on site was the really earliest thing since the early days of Parsoid. Site has been ported. And so that is, the implementation is substantially different simply because of the way it evolved. But I think most of the other extensions are pretty straightforward, I think. Yeah.
Okay. When we were at All Hands, you had expressed some concern about maybe the link syntax for Semantic MediaWiki. Is that still potentially a concern?
Oh yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, so I think Semantic MediaWiki uses a hook which changes the behavior of link Wikitext. So yeah, we are not planning to support that functionality at all. But I believe there is a workaround based on a tag parser function, I think, or a parser function, not tag parser function, to do the same functionality in Semantic MediaWiki. So I think as long as all those are converted to use the parser function, I think it should be fine. But yeah, we are not planning to support functionality that changes the behavior of what Wikitext is, because it simply makes for a lot of various edge cases and hard to debug scenarios. So that is our current position right now, yeah.
Yeah, there is a set parser function, although admittedly there are quite a few semantic wikis out there that are using the old syntax that would have to migrate if that were the only solution, but yeah.
Presumably, I think we can, I mean, that is easily fixable with a bot, right? It's very simple transformation, I imagine.
All right, any other questions for Subbu? All right,